Welcome, everyone. My name is Jesse Fulton, Director of Producer Education with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome you as we conclude our three-part Cattlemen's webinar series that focused on protein and energy. We are proud to be working with several industry leaders to bring you the latest on the topic. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on the screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many as we can as time allows. If you're having trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just look for the producer tab on the website. Now, I want to thank our sponsor for this webinar, the National Corn Growers Association. Now, a few comments from Michael Granche, the Manager of Market Development with National Corn Growers Association. Michael?
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Granche, and I am the Manager of Market Development for the National Corn Growers Association. On behalf of NCGA, thank you so much for having us here tonight and letting us be a part of this webinar. At NCGA, we're always happy to partner with NCBA for events like this to help circulate information to folks in the industry. Cattle is a critical customer for corn, and we're so appreciative of this partnership, and we're so excited for all the great work ahead of us. The webinar tonight will feature Dr. Amanda Blair, North Dakota State University, and Dr. Jana Block with North Dakota State University. Dr. Block, the floor is yours.
All right, sounds good. Well, hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us tonight. Dr. Blair and I really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all. Wish we could be speaking face-to-face, but this will have to do. So we do sure encourage you to follow up with either one of us if you have questions or want to have a little more discussion after the presentation. So in the previous protein and energy supplementation webinars, Dr. Smith, Lemkuhler, Stewart, and Lallman did a really nice job of providing you with some research and production data that provides a foundation for managing nutrition. So we're going to be referring back to some of those principles throughout the evening. And our goal is to provide you with background and research results about how nutrition during gestation not only affects the cow, but also may affect lifetime performance of her calf. So just wanted to start with a recap of the few major concepts that were previously covered. First of all, we know that forages alone typically can't meet cow requirements throughout an entire production year, and we really rely on supplementation to help fill those gaps. So as presented previously, we've just listed a few of the factors here that influence requirements, and these factors can make adequate nutrition a little bit of a moving target, as you're all well aware. There is a lot of literature available in regard to supplementation, but we don't always see consistent animal responses in terms of body weight gains or improvements in pregnancy rates, for example. This is likely due to all the factors listed in the first bullet, combined with the variation in forage quality and, of course, the different types and amounts of supplements being used. And finally, of course, the best supplementation strategy is going to vary based on the biological type of your cattle, the environment that they experience on your ranch, your own individual production goals, and of course, your available feeds and management. So for the best outcome, this strategy should be determined based on tools that were mentioned previously, such as laboratory analysis of forages and monitoring cow performance through body condition scoring. So what does a cow go through in a typical production year? The graphic on the right is going to kind of walk you through that cycle from calving all the way through late gestation. And you will also see example protein and energy requirements listed in each section. And so those are for a 1,400-pound cow at 20 pounds of milk during peak lactation. So if we start here at calving and look at early lactation and breeding segment, this is obviously the time of highest nutrient requirements for our cow herds. That peak lactation, which has been discussed previously, that's going to occur around 2 months after calving, and it does also coincide with breeding season. So in this approximately 85-day window, we have to get cows to lactate, recover from calving, resume their heat cycles, and get bred. And so all of that requires really good nutritional management so that body stores are adequate to support all those different functions. As Dr. Lallman mentioned during the energy webinar, it's almost impossible to put weight on a lactating cow because most of the additional nutrients we would provide are going to go towards milk production. As we move into late lactation, requirements are going to start to decrease a little bit as milk production starts to go down. At weaning, of course, the lactation requirement is going to go away, and cows are just going to be maintaining themselves and their developing fetus. Now, the fetus at this point will have very small requirements, but as we're going to discuss in more detail later, there's still a lot of important systems that are being developed in those first few months. This is also a time of year where a lot of forages are starting to go dormant for spring calving herds, and many times our supplementation programs haven't started yet. So just a first question for you to consider, at a time where we might be letting cows kind of do their own thing, possibly lose a little bit of condition, how might our management be affecting the developing calf? And that might not be a question that you've thought about too much, or it might be one that you have thought about. Going on into mid-gestation, requirements are typically at their lowest point. You can see that both protein and energy are reduced and extremely different from our early lactation segment. Obviously, no milk production requirements, and still the fetal requirements are fairly small. With the low requirements, this is a really good time to start thinking about increasing condition in some of our thinner cows and preparing for late gestation and calving. So as I'll show you in a few minutes, the majority of calf growth is going to occur during late gestation, particularly the last 60 days. At that time, obviously, the cow is also preparing for lactation and colostrum production, so those requirements are increasing again. Still can gain condition during this time, but it's not as efficient as during mid-gestation. So we just talked about how the nutrient requirements will change throughout the production year and how cow performance might be affected. Obviously, calf performance is important, but most of the time we're focused on performance after birth. And how often are we really thinking about the fetal calf besides maybe at preg checking time? So tonight we're going to talk about a growing body of research that shows that the environment experienced by the fetus during gestation can play a huge role in calf performance, including health, reproductive performance, and even meat quality. So essentially, this evolving area of research has highlighted the fact that what mom eats matters. This concept is generally referred to as fetal or developmental programming, and it centers around the idea that what the cow eats and also what she just endures during pregnancy can influence all the factors listed here that are indicators of lifetime potential of her calf. So how does this occur? Well, to be very honest with you, we don't completely understand all of the mechanisms for how this happens. On a basic level, we understand that some of the alterations to the uterine environment, such as limited nutrient availability, hormonal and metabolic changes, or different types of stressors, can lead to insufficient placental development, changes in fetal metabolism and growth, and also changes in fetal gene expression, basically turning genes on or off. There can also be heritable or epigenetic changes in the fetal genome, and these are changes that are not encoded in the DNA, but are stable and can be passed to subsequent generations. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Blair for a little bit of background on where this fetal programming theory comes from and how it applies today.
Great, thanks, Dr. Block, and good evening, everyone. Some of the foundational work investigating the effects of maternal nutrition on offspring outcomes was conducted by researchers with an interest in the health status of people that experienced what is known as the Dutch hunger winter. So I'll go into a little bit of detail on that event. During World War II, there was an embargo on food transport into the Nazi-occupied western section of the Netherlands. And this was in the winter of 1944 into the spring of 1945, so basically the last 6 months or so of the war. This embargo was coupled with a severe famine in that area that led to daily rations somewhere between 400 and 800 calories per person per day. So that's how much food or calories were available to those people during that time in that area. and that's much lower than the about 2,000 calories that are recommended for most adults. During this time, as you might expect, there were also women that were pregnant, and they were exposed to this severe food shortage and had children during or shortly after this time period. What researchers have been able to do and to analyze is they were able to go back into medical and military records of these children that were born during or shortly after this event. And they found that these children at birth, they had lighter birth weights, but as they followed them into adulthood, they had a greater likelihood of developing obesity, diabetes, and heart disease later in life. And it's been suggested that these children had developed what's called a thrifty phenotype due to the limited amount of nutrients available during gestation. So essentially, they were being programmed in utero or during gestation to deal with the environment that they were born into. So in this case, if the maternal environment was signaling limited food or limited calories available, they were being programmed to store fat or to be thrifty. We might call this being an easy keeper in the cattle industry. But then when these children grew up and food was plentiful, that thriftiness resulted in obesity and the accompanying metabolic issues that I listed. Another thing that was, I think, kind of fascinating out of this research is that they also noted that the trimester of exposure mattered. And we're going to cover some of the events that go on developmentally in each trimester in just a few slides. Since this work, others have conducted similar epidemiological research and discovered links connecting extreme maternal environments to a host of other human health issues and diseases such as cancer, high blood pressure, and a range of neurological issues. But I would maintain that this is really not a new concept. We might be using and introducing you to new terms like fetal or developmental programming, but I think on the whole, we've known for a long time that what mom does during pregnancy can affect the baby. I don't think it's really news to anyone that pregnant mothers shouldn't drink or smoke, and that they should eat healthy because that can impact that developing fetus. So you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with beef production? So we'll move on from the history lesson and switch gears and focus on cows. So if we consider that the gestational environment can influence lifetime health and productivity of the calf, think about the highs and lows that your cows might encounter during gestation. There might be swings in forage quantity and quality, changes in diet, or weather extremes that your cows might have to encounter. And these are really going to vary at different time points during gestation, depending on your location and what resources are available. And because of seasonal changes in forage quality and traditional approaches to supplementation, maternal nutrient restriction is usually thought of as the most likely nutritional issue facing gestating dams. However, there's also periods of time where cows may be in confinement, or we have lush forage growth, where overconsumption and nutritional excess could be an issue. And there's actually research that shows developmental programming of the offspring in response to excess maternal nutrition, as well as restricted or limited nutrition. There's specific nutrient imbalances, such as minerals in the maternal diet, have also been shown to have negative consequences for the developing offspring. We're not going to touch too much onto that subject tonight, keeping this focus more on protein and energy. If you'll recall, I mentioned that timing matters, timing during gestation. So I'd like to quickly review kind of the timeline of fetal development to provide a better idea of what's going on in there during gestation before we dive into some of the research on this topic. So most of you as producers certainly recognize that a great deal has to occur in the approximately 270-ish to 285 days from fertilization to birth. But for the purposes of this topic, I think it's important to remember that these developmental events occur in parallel with that production cycle of the cow that Dr. Block described earlier. Generally, fetal development is often divided or described in trimesters, those being early, mid, and late gestation. So we'll briefly review what's occurring at each segment related to fetal growth and development to help frame how maternal nutrition may influence the calf at different points during gestation. It's also good, and Dr. Block alluded to this as well, to remember that a productive cow is generally never eating just for herself. She's either gestating, nursing a calf at her side, or gestating and nursing throughout her productive year. So we'll work through the major developmental events that occur during each trimester, and you can see the approximate days that correlate with each segment of gestation in the timeline on the top of the slide. So starting with early gestation, after the embryo enters the uterus, one of the first things that happens is maternal recognition of pregnancy, which is essentially the dam's body recognizing that she's pregnant and adjusting hormone levels to maintain the fetus in the pregnancy. Following that, the placenta will attach to the uterine wall and begin to grow. Fetal organs develop starting around day 21 of gestation, and many of these organs are involved in the development of the immune system, which is also beginning to develop very early in gestation. The survival organs, such as the brain and the heart, take priority for nutrients, which means that if there's a shortage or a limited amount of nutrients available, less critical organs and tissues could be compromised in their development to ensure the development of the vital organs. Another important event that occurs in early gestation is the first stage of follicle development in females. A follicle is basically a small fluid-filled sac located inside the ovary that contains an immature egg. And cattle are born with all the eggs that they'll ever have. So the follicles formed during early gestation represent the pool of eggs that will be the lifetime supply of that female. And this is one of those critical events that I don't think gets much attention, but could potentially influence lifetime reproductive potential of that female. Now, my background is in meat science, actually, so I'm not going to delve much more into the repro discussion, but I think it's a key point to bring up related to reproductive performance and how this is involved in very early gestation. So switching to a tissue I'm a little more familiar with, early gestation is also when primary muscle fibers are developed. It's important to note here that cattle are also born with all the muscle fibers they'll ever have. And the formation of primary muscle fibers at this stage of gestation sets the stage for muscle deposition throughout the rest of gestation, as well as postnatally or after birth. And then lastly the majority of placental growth occurs early and into mid-gestation to support the developing fetus. We'll switch into talking about what goes on during mid-gestation. And here we really see a continued growth of vital organs and an increase in fetal size. Mid-gestation is also the key developmental time point for both muscle and fat tissues. And this is where the majority of my interest in this topic of maternal nutrition is focused. I have an interest in understanding if we can manipulate or optimize carcass composition through alterations in maternal nutrition. So as I mentioned, primary muscle fibers, and they're depicted by that dark triangle on the very left-hand side of the slide. These primary muscle fibers begin to develop during early gestation. These fibers function to act as a scaffolding for the secondary muscle fibers to develop on or around. However, the bulk of the muscle mass of the animal is actually made up of these secondary fibers that are developed. And as you can see in that second triangle in the middle, that dark one, they really peak in development right around mid-gestation. Development of new fibers is estimated to end sometime in early and late gestation. And while these fibers can and will get bigger postnatally, we don't get more of them. So again, they're born with the number of muscle fibers that they're going to have. We can make them bigger, and you see this depicted by the final dark triangle on the very right. We can see muscle fiber hypertrophy or growth extending out even past birth. We can make them bigger, but we can't make more of them. And this is really important because anything that could compromise muscle cell development during mid-gestation could impact future muscle mass of the animal. Now, fat cells here are represented by the lighter blue triangle, and they work a bit differently. They begin to develop in mid-gestation, but they can and do continue to develop postnatally. So we can add more fat cells after the animal is born. But again, any insult to early development may alter the establishment or of cell numbers, or how many fat cells are there, and then influence the distribution of those cells across various fat depots. And truthfully, while I might think that these are the most important tissues because of their ultimate relevance to the carcass, on the whole, they rank pretty low in terms of importance to the developing fetus. So if their nutrients are limited at mid-gestation, priority is certainly going to be given to the vital organs, and muscle and fat cell development could be compromised. And then finally, just to touch on what goes on during late gestation, this stage is traditionally thought of and generally gets the most attention in regard to how we feed the dam. We know that there's a significant increase in nutrient requirements at this stage due to the increase in requirements to support calf growth and prepare for lactation, like Dr. Block mentioned. In this graph, you can see if we have a calf that's born at 80 pounds, it's going to weigh somewhere around 20 to 25 pounds, where the intersection of those lines occur right at the beginning of the third trimester. And from that point on, the cow's going to gain somewhere around 1 pound per day in fetal weight, fetal tissue, up until parturition. Also during this time in late gestation, muscle fibers are going to increase in size, and fat cells are going to continue to develop and begin to fill up with lipid or fill up with fat. We also can see continued growth of the organs and final developmental stages of the lungs near the very end of late gestation. So right now I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Block to discuss some of the relevant research in this area, specifically focused again for this talk in this series on maternal protein and energy nutrition. And we're going to walk through some of this research discussion kind of by trimester.
All right, thank you, Dr. Blair. So now that we've given you a little bit of background on the fetal programming theory and some more details on fetal development, we're going to share the results of a few studies with you. Obviously, this isn't going to be an all-inclusive lit review that we'd like to give you, but we tried to focus on some studies that we felt would be applicable to many of your production systems and areas of interest to you guys. So to start off, I want to give just a little bit of background about early gestation in the placenta, which was mentioned in that fetal development timeline. Obviously, the proper placental development is really the key in ensuring that that fetus is going to develop normally, which is really highly dependent on good maternal nutrition. So you see my little equation up here: caruncles and cotyledons equal placentomes. So the caruncles are the site of attachment of the placenta to the uterine wall of the dam, and the cotyledon is the attachment on the fetal side. And together, these form the placentomes, which are the area where all of the gas, nutrients, and waste are exchanged between the dam and the calf. So also, as Dr. Blair mentioned, the majority of that placental growth is going to happen in the first part of gestation. However, the blood flow is going to have to increase drastically in late gestation to meet the increasing demands of that growing calf. So if for some reason we don't have proper blood vessel development in the placenta due to inadequate nutrition, the placenta is not going to be able to support the increase in blood flow and calf growth. So if nutrition is inadequate, some of the consequences that we might see are limited nutrient availability and oxygen for the fetus, and also decreased expression of growth factors that are necessary to help develop those new blood vessels in the placenta. Also, I think it's important to mention a large number of fetal losses occur early in gestation, and those are typically due to intrauterine growth retardation, or IUGR. So IUGR is mainly a function of inadequate uterine capacity, which is largely tied to inadequate maternal nutrition. So just for a little bit of research on this topic, and just to set you up for some of the data slides that we'll be showing you throughout the rest of the presentation, just kind of a little timeline again at the top. And then we have some arrows that describe the treatments that were imposed in the different studies, just so you can kind of keep that straight in your head as we go. So this study was conducted at the University of Wyoming, and beginning at around 30 days of gestation and continuing through day 125, cows were assigned to either a control treatment to gain 1.5 pounds a day, or a nutrient-restricted or NR treatment that was designed to provide 68% of net energy for maintenance requirements and 87% of metabolizable protein requirements, both terms you have seen in previous webinars. So a subset of the cows from each treatment group were selected for a necropsy on day 125 of the study. And after that point, the nutrient-restricted cows were fed to be realimented and get body condition score similar to the control cows. They then conducted another necropsy on day 245 of gestation in the additional cows that were remaining from that subset. So looking at the necropsy on day 125, it was very clear that there were two distinct groups of fetuses within that NR group. So 40% of the calves from that group were significantly smaller and had increased organ weights. So as Dr. Blair mentioned, those kind of vital organs tend to get nutrient priority in case of nutrient restriction. And we definitely saw that in this study with those increased fetal brain and tendency for increased fetal heart rate. If you look at the graph on the right, you can see the fetal weights similar between the control and nutrient restricted non-IUGR groups, and then about a 20% decrease over here in the nutrient restricted IUGR group. So other findings in the study were that cows in the nutrient-restricted IUGR group averaged 3.5 years of age, and the non-IUGR group averaged 5 years. So this is consistent with the concept that cows are still growing up to around 4 to even 5 years of age, and they're going to have increased nutrient requirements to support their own growth, which can make them more susceptible to a nutrient deficiency. And they have a less ability to buffer that nutrient deficiency to their calves. When we went out to the necropsy on day 245, the researchers didn't see any differences in fetal weights or organ weights at that time. So it's kind of interesting, but the cotyledon weights, which you remember are the attachment of the placenta, those were still lower for the nutrient-restricted group, even after body condition scores were restored after day 125. So when you look at the results of this study overall, it's pretty clear that we could have a bout of IUGR that occurs early in gestation that may go undetected if birth weight is not impacted. So let's go back to the development of the immune system. As Dr. Blair mentioned earlier, the innate immune system begins very early in gestation, and it starts with embryonic stem cell formation, liver development and establishment of bone marrow. That's followed by development of the thymus gland, spleen, and lymph nodes. And those are all present within the first trimester and then continue to develop throughout gestation and into early postnatal life. Similar to muscle and fat cells, this system has a lower priority for nutrient use and is likely to be affected by maternal nutrition. And as we all know, a well-developed immune system is going to be critical for animal survival and health, also for performance throughout the lifetime. However, most of the time, this is not an area that research is going to focus in on. Most of the time, we're looking at those production responses. However, it's important to keep in mind the huge role that the immune system plays in all of these production outcomes. Okay, don't get too overwhelmed. It looks like this graphic is a little bit complex, but it just kind of shows the variety of ways that maternal nutrition can influence overall calf health and survival. So if you look at the number 1, you can see the different effects that the diet might have prior to conception on the genome and also the developing embryo. You can also then, looking at 1A, we've got diet during gestation. You can see the epigenetic effects that I mentioned earlier, as well as effects on the placenta, the fetal immune system, and then fetal organ function and development that I also mentioned. We're also going to have direct effects on maternal colostrum, which I'll talk about here in a couple of slides. And this can definitely affect immune function of the calf. Obviously, that's an important component of passive immunity from the dam. It can also affect BAT, or brown adipose tissue, which is necessary for heat generation in newborn calves. And so those fat stores can be affected by maternal nutrition as well. So ultimately, the susceptibility to disease and overall survival of the calf is going to be based on the gestational diet and even the diet prior to conception. So we'll take a little bit of a look here at colostrum quality, some of the studies that have taken a look at this. It's not always evaluated, so these kind of have a range in years and things like that. The first one here by Huff and others is a 2-year study, and cows were fed at either 57% or 100% of nutrient requirements during the last 90 days of gestation. So it was a little bit later treatment period. At calving, all the cows received an adequate amount of the diet, and they found that treatment did not affect the IgG concentration in the diet. However, they did feed calves born within each treatment group either colostrum from their own dam or colostrum from a cow from the other nutritional treatment group. So there would have been calves born to restricted dams that receive restricted colostrum, and also calves born to non-restricted dams that receive restricted colostrum. And those calves that did receive restricted colostrum from restricted cows tended to have lower serum IgG concentrations. That's just a measure of immunoglobulins 24 hours after birth. So kind of indicates that the ability of the calf to absorb those immunoglobulins was affected. The second study by Morial and others, cows were fed at 70% or 100% of net energy for maintenance requirements during the last 40 days. And again, did not see any differences between serum IgG levels in the calves at birth. There were some other things that those researchers observed, obviously a little more weight loss in the cows and some things like that, but no differences in the ability of that calf apparently to absorb colostrum. And then the final study on this slide, Shell and others, again, implemented about a 30% restriction and also fed at 110% of energy requirements. So those were the two comparisons, beginning at 90 days of gestation. So they were throughout the second and third trimester. And it was very interesting. The restricted cows actually had immunoglobulin concentrations double that of the control cows. However, they didn't see any differences in IgG in the calf serum. So some researchers have speculated that the increased immunoglobulins that we might see in the case of some of these restrictions is basically going to occur as that cow is attempting to maintain that transfer of passive immunity in the face of a restricted diet. So maybe that cow is somehow prioritizing the production of those immunoglobulins for her calf. But we have to wonder what might be being sacrificed that we're not measuring. And so, some of these studies might not show the results that you would expect to see, but it's important to remember that there can be consequences that we're not even aware of, and that a lot of these treatments can have other implications in the offspring. So now I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Blair to talk about some studies related to animal performance and carcass quality.
All right, so we'll switch here and talk about mid-gestation. And as I mentioned when we were going through the fetal development timeline, mid-gestation is that key time point for the development of muscle and fat, which are the major tissues of a carcass. And to provide some context and maybe give you a question to think about relative to this, give some thought to the percent of a feedlot steer's life that is spent in gestation. So from conception to harvest, if we assume a steer is harvested, say at 16 months of age, what percentage of that animal's life would be spent in gestation? And go ahead and kind of give you the answer here, but I think it's kind of fascinating. They spend about 37 or 38% of their life in gestation giving these parameters of a 15-month-old animal at harvest. So when we think about growth and carcass outcomes of a feedlot steer, gestation is actually a pretty significant segment of their life. Over a third of their life is spent in gestation. And mid-gestation is believed to be a key time point in regard to outcomes related to feeding cattle, such as growth performance, yield, and quality grade or quality parameters. Jana, you could go ahead and switch that. Thank you. I'm going to share with you some research that imposed specific nutrient restrictions to cows during mid-gestation and talk about how that impacted performance and primarily carcass outcomes. We'll touch on a few other performance traits. In these studies, again, in the arrows on the top will help indicate kind of what the treatments were and when they were applied. So this first study was conducted here at South Dakota State University, and we exposed cows to diets that would either cause them to maintain body condition score about 5 during mid-gestation, or cause them to lose a body condition score, primarily through an energy restriction at mid-gestation. And then at the end of mid-gestation and going into late gestation, all the cows were placed back on the same adequate energy diet. So this resulted in cows that were either in a positive or negative energy status during mid-gestation. So getting into the results here, similar to other studies that have evaluated mid-gestation nutrient restriction in beef cows, we didn't find any differences in birth weight with this mid-gestation restriction. However, we did observe that calves from the restricted cows were lighter at weaning in the receiving period, and this persisted until about 57 days post-weaning. So into the early phases of the feeding period, they were lighter if they came from restricted dams or dams in a negative energy status. This weight difference was kind of negated or went away by the end of the study, and we didn't observe any differences in body weight or final body weight, hot carcass weight, also no differences in ribeye area. We measured meat color, and we also evaluated meat tenderness, and we didn't find any differences in those traits. We did, however, observe an increase in the ratio of marbling to back fat, indicating that maternal restriction may have shifted the distribution of fat within the body. And so they actually had those calves from the cows in a negative energy status had increased marbling relative to back fat. We also saw a tendency for a decrease in the amount of back fat and an improvement in yield grade in those calves from the negative energy status dams. And then in the graph on the right, this shows another kind of aspect of this project. We evaluated the offspring's ability to mount an immune response in the feedlot, and how we did this basically was by providing or injecting a novel antigen into the calves and it was called ovalbumin, so it's an egg protein. So it would cause them to have an immune response, but it wouldn't make them sick. But we could basically measure the antibody titers and see how their immune system reacted to that novel antigen. And as you can see in this graph, we found that calves from the dams in a negative energy status, that would be represented by the solid line on the graph, had a reduced immune response when challenged with that ovalbumin or that novel antigen. So possibly indicating that their health status wasn't quite as good as those that came from the positive energy status treatment. So while there may have been some benefits to some of the carcass outcomes we saw when the cows were allowed to lose some of their body condition at mid-gestation, the effects on receiving weight and potential health implications in the feedlot would certainly be a concern. And in a second study, my colleague at South Dakota State University, Dr. Keith Underwood, evaluated the effects of a protein restriction. So switching gears and talking about protein during mid-gestation, this is during his work on his PhD at the University of Wyoming. And in this study, again, in the arrows at the top, you can see cows were started out in early gestation on native range, fairly low crude protein values. And half of those cows were moved to native range, or from native range to improved pasture that provided about 11% crude protein. So half went to improved pasture and then half stayed on the native range during mid-gestation. And then into late gestation, all the cows were moved back onto the native range, but provided an alfalfa supplement. So in their results, no differences were observed in birth weight or weaning weight with this protein adjustment. However, the calves exposed to a mid-gestation protein restriction had decreased average daily gains, decreased final body weight, and lighter hot carcass weights. Now, these weight differences didn't translate to differences in ribeye area, yield grade, or marbling, so it was primarily affecting weight. But they did report a decrease in back fat in the calves from the restricted dams, as well as a decrease in tenderness. And that's change in tenderness is shown in the graph on the right of the slide. And this is depicted, basically they looked at what's known as shear force. So this is an objective measure of tenderness. So the higher the number, the tougher the sample, or the more force it would take to shear through that steak. And we see that those shear force values are increased in meat from the progeny or the offspring of the dams on native range that would have been protein restricted during mid-gestation. So they were tougher. At SCSU, we also found similar results in tenderness when we applied a metabolizable protein restriction. And there's some research in sheep that might provide some insight into this influence on tenderness, where they basically found that nutrient restriction in sheep increased the number of connective tissue cells. And connective tissue is a major factor that influences tenderness. So the more connective tissue there is, the tougher the meat is. And this could potentially have contributed to some of the differences in the beef studies, but connective tissue wasn't evaluated in those studies. So I mentioned another study at South Dakota State where we evaluated a metabolizable protein restriction, and I'll share just a bit more about that study. Here at mid-gestation, we left half of the dams on basically on 100% of their requirements for metabolizable protein, so that served as our control. And then half of the dams, and these were first calf heifers in this study, were restricted to 80% of their metabolizable protein requirements. And then in late gestation, we did a crossover where half from each treatment were switched over to the other treatment. So the dams were weighed and ultrasounded during gestation to evaluate their condition. And probably not surprisingly, we found that the protein restricted heifers lost body weight, and they also lost ribeye area as evaluated by ultrasound. So that would indicate that they were mobilizing their own muscle tissue during this restriction. However, when we look at the results, these treatments did not influence calving or calf vigor at birth, no differences in birth or weaning weights, no difference in milk production or reproductive performance of those dams post-calving. And there was also no significant differences in offspring feedlot performance or carcass measurements. So this suggests that it's possible for a progeny to overcome a moderate gestational metabolizable protein restriction with minimal impacts on carcass composition or meat characteristics. And again, it may be that those heifers were giving up their own body reserves as we saw a change in their ribeye area to kind of buffer this insult to the developing calf. And I want to kind of close this section on mid-gestation and share just a few more studies from researchers across the country to highlight a trend that we've begun to see in that adipose tissue or fat tissue appears to be one of the more sensitive tissues to alterations in maternal nutrition. So 3 studies here that I'll just briefly share with you. Researchers at Utah State University compared cows that were allowed to maintain body condition to cows that lost about a condition score and a half during mid-gestation. And they reported no differences in progeny birth or weaning weight and no change in feedlot performance. But similar to our findings at SDSU with our energy restriction, they reported a trend for calves from restricted dams to have an improved marbling to back fat ratio. Again, highlighting the sensitivity of fat tissue to this maternal nutrition. Secondly, researchers at Ohio State University compared different sources of energy. So cows were either provided ad libitum access to grass hay or limit-fed corn or limit-fed dry distillers grains from mid through late gestation. And they reported calf birth and weaning weights were heavier from those dams fed corn and DDGs, but no differences in hot carcass weight or yield traits of those offspring. They did, however, find that offspring from the corn-fed dams had reduced marbling scores. Again, treatments were, in this case, affecting a fat depot here. And then finally, at the University of Wyoming, cows were fed either 70% or 100% of their nutrient requirements from early through mid-gestation, and they reported calves from restricted dams had higher yield grades, so more towards a 5, lighter semitendinosus weights, and that's a muscle from the round, so this muscle was lighter, and then larger fat cells, once again showing the susceptibility of fat to respond to these maternal treatments. In this study, they also evaluated the ovaries of the female offspring at harvest and found that heifers from nutrient-restricted dams had reduced ovarian and luteal weights compared to those that were not restricted. Now, there's been some conflicting data, some studies finding effects on production traits and some not finding those same results. But it's important to realize that this is a relatively new area of research, and we have a lot more to learn. There's also differences I'd like to point out across studies that could influence the outcome and potentially could influence some questions that you might have. You know, would this type of event occur on my operation? And some of those factors would be the influence of the severity and the timing of the nutrient restriction, so how severe it is and when it happens during gestation, as well as the type and extent of the nutrient modification, whether that be an excess or restriction, what nutrient we're talking about, whether it's protein or energy or global restriction, or the age of the dam during gestation. Is it heifers or these mature cows? So some of those things can definitely affect some of these outcomes and may contribute to some of the conflicting data. Also, just to close out, I've focused this kind of mid-gestation discussion primarily on performance and carcass traits, but it's important to consider the influence on female offspring that could be retained in the herd. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Block to discuss some of these fertility-related outcomes, as well as impacts on health and performance traits influenced in late gestation.
All right, thank you again, Dr. Blair. Okay, so all of the studies presented in this table evaluated offspring health due to a nutritional insult in late gestation. So starting here with Cora and colleagues back in '75. So it's kind of interesting when you look at the age on that study and think, we're telling you that fetal programming is a relatively new topic, and that's primarily true, but there were a lot of researchers, you know, back in that period that were evaluating birth weights and performance, and just we hadn't necessarily developed the theory or hypothesis behind why we were seeing what we were seeing, but those traits were still measured. Anyway, in this study here, heifers were fed at 100% or 65% of their energy requirements in the last 100 days of gestation, as you can see from the table. Some of the results from that study, mortality was 10% in restricted heifers versus 3% in control heifers, so increased losses in restricted heifers. They also applied similar treatments in cows, but fed 117% of energy requirements in the last 30 days. So they were restricted and during those first about 60 to 70 days, and then fed at excess in the last 30 days. And in that study, the incidence of scours was increased by about 20% for calves from restricted cows. Looking at the study by Stalker and his colleagues, calf survival was about 5% higher for supplemented versus non-supplemented cows that were losing body reserves in the third trimester. And in that study, they also evaluated the serum IgG concentrations in the calves between 24 and 48 hours after birth, and those were not altered by dam nutrition, but something is obviously still impacting the health of those calves. Larson and others reported that the incidence of BRD and gastrointestinal diseases in the feedlot was 10% higher for steers born to unsupplemented dams, again, losing body condition or body reserves in the third trimester. And that last study listed here by Morial was covered in the discussion about colostrum quality. And if you remember, I mentioned that there can be consequences even if IgG levels weren't affected. So in this case, offspring had reduced BVD titers following vaccination post-weaning. So there was definitely a health impact there. So even if we don't know all the direct mechanisms, it's clear that restricted nutrition in late gestation can result in calves with increased susceptibility to various types of diseases and probably increased neonatal and postnatal death losses. So I want to show you a recent study that was just published in Meat Science this past summer. And you can see at the top here, nutritional treatment started around day 180 of gestation, and cows were fed at either 50%, 75%, or 100% of energy requirements. And this is a pretty severe restriction when you start talking about 50% of energy requirements, so keep that in mind. So all cows received adequate nutrition post-calving. The calves were managed normally, and after weaning, the steer progeny were placed on native range until they were 24 months of age, and then they were placed in a feedlot for 104 days prior to harvest. So these steers were a little bit older when they were harvested. That could potentially play into these results as well. But some of the other responses that they saw, obviously a reduction in birth weight. And it is actually very challenging to see a birth weight reduction in beef cattle. They're just not as sensitive to nutrient restrictions as you might see in other species such as sheep. Again, that mama cow kind of compensates for her fetus and kind of takes the hit. So, but there was approximately a 10-pound reduction in birth weights for the calves from dams that were restricted at 50% compared to no restriction. They also did see a compensatory gain response, which should not be uncommon, in the steer calves from the extremely restricted dams. And they had increased average daily gain from birth to harvest. So those were compared to the other two treatment groups. And we looked at carcass quality of the steer progeny. Dressing percentage and ribeye area were not different among the treatments. However, they did report that 12th rib fat thickness was greater in those offspring from dams on the 75% restriction versus the 50 or 100%. So essentially the muscling in the steers didn't appear to be affected, but there were some kind of inconsistent responses in fat accumulation in those carcasses. So this kind of goes back to the timing of muscle and fat development in the fetus, thinking about late gestation, and also emphasizes that fat accumulation during postnatal life may have the potential to override some of those fetal programming effects. So we've talked a lot tonight about different restrictions, but I wanted to also focus on what effects maybe some supplementation have on calf performance results. So protein supplementation in late gestation is a pretty common practice in a lot of areas, which we've discussed. And while the cow performances are typically fairly consistent in the literature, there are some differences. We find that the impacts of supplementation on offspring are a little bit more variable. So I'll show you some of those different responses here in the next couple of slides. So this was a 3-year study out of Nebraska. They used spring calving cows to compare supplemental protein in late gestation versus no supplement for cows that were just grazing dormant range. The steer and heifer calf performance were published in 2 different publications. So I'm going to present the heifer data here in a few minutes. We'll just focus on the calf data and also the steer offspring data. So as you can see from the table, there were no differences in calf birth weight. However, there was a higher percentage of calves weaned from supplemented dams versus unsupplemented, and those calves did have a little bit of a weaning weight advantage. The steer calves in this study were fed to finish, and the individual carcass data was collected. There were no differences in hot carcass weight, dressing percentage, marbling scores, or the percentage of offspring that graded choice. However, you do see some slight numerical tendencies there, with the supplemented calves being a little bit higher numerically. Okay, just to show you a couple differences in the results from the previous study, here's a follow-up trial. It was also conducted in Nebraska, and that was evaluating steer and heifer offspring performance from dams grazing either winter range or cornstalk residue and receiving no supplement or protein supplement. So for the purposes of reporting this data, I'm focusing strictly on responses due to supplementation. So we're kind of ignoring the winter range and corn residue. Looking at the steer offspring on the left-hand side of the slide, the supplemented cows tended to have a little bit heavier steer calves, which is different from the results reported by the previous study where they didn't see any birth weight differences. This response was pretty minimal and probably not biologically significant. But also in contrast to the previous study, there were no differences in the percentage of calves weaned. If we're looking at the carcass data, the steers from the protein supplemented dams had increased marbling scores and a greater proportion grading choice or higher, but they did not report any impacts on 12th rib fat thickness, yield grade, or ribeye area. So again, if you remember back to that muscle and fat development timeline, the authors in this study speculated that supplementation in late gestation may have changed some of the sites of nutrient deposition in those offspring. So if we're looking at the heifer offspring, no differences in birth weight in the heifers. So this indicates that there's that the sex might differentially influence how calf responds to maternal nutrition. They did see a slight increase in weaning weights in the heifer calves, but this basically disappeared post-weaning and they were similar weights at puberty. Although the heifers from the supplemented calves tended to reach puberty approximately 2 weeks earlier. Again, this was just a tendency, but it was something that showed up. So as you can see, as I mentioned, all these studies were conducted in Nebraska. So even with a similar production environment and a similar genetic background in these cows, it's pretty difficult to get a consistent offspring response due to maternal protein supplementation. Okay, we're going to switch gears again on you. Hopefully, not jumping around too much, but we wanted to make sure that we're talking about all these different types of production traits. So we've talked a little bit about calf health, feedlot performance, and meat quality. And another question that's getting a lot of attention, obviously it's very important, is what happens to fertility of female offspring? So some studies in the literature have demonstrated that there is an improved fertility of offspring in response to fetal programming. But again, the exact mechanisms for why this happens maybe aren't quite so clear. And we do have a lot of other studies that report maybe some indicator traits of fertility, things like age of puberty, which I've reported to you in a couple of other studies, maybe some developmental things that are going on. But these aren't necessarily directly correlated to a change in fertility of the progeny. So the other challenge that we have with this type of research is many times we don't follow heifer offspring past about their first breeding and or calving season. There's lots of competition for research animals at university. It's very expensive to follow those animals throughout their productive life, et cetera. Those are just kind of some of the things we face. So it's really difficult to take the results from maybe a 1 or 2 year study and try to apply those to lifetime performance of the offspring. I did want to mention, I'm not going to present the data tonight due to timing, but there are a couple of research programs in Nebraska and Montana that have evaluated multiple generations of female offspring and looked at different maternal nutritional options and tried to kind of characterize what happens to those female offspring. So if you want more information about those studies, just go ahead and follow up with me later. But in general, I mean, we can kind of see some interesting results in the studies I'm going to share with you here, but we definitely need to have a better understanding of the mechanisms behind why these are taking place before we make any strong conclusions. This is a study that was conducted by Cushman and others. They used around 400 beef cows, and they were assigned to either low, moderate, or high nutrient intake during the second or third trimester. So you see up here at the top, low, high would be low during the second trimester and high in the third trimester. So there was a total of 4 treatment combinations here in this study. No differences in the percentage of heifers that were pubertal at the beginning of the breeding season, and there were no differences in age at puberty. So those are all consistent across those treatments. They did an antral follicle count, and that was based on ultrasound. And antral follicle count is basically an indicator of the ovarian reserve that Amanda mentioned earlier. And so a higher number is associated with potentially increased fertility, but again, that relationship is somewhat sketchy and not firmly established at this time. No differences in the percent of heifers that were pregnant after a 60-day breeding season, but it did appear that heifers that were born to jams that had an increased level of nutrition during late gestation, so the low high and the moderate high, conceived earlier in the breeding season, since a higher percentage of those heifers calved in the first 21 days. So those researchers also went back and grouped heifers by their calving period, and they reported that antral follicle count was greater for the heifers that calved in the first 21 days. So again, just trying to establish that relationship between AFC and potentially fertility. Just a couple other studies evaluating a female offspring response. Funston and coworkers reported that heifers from dams that were supplemented with protein were heavier at pre-breeding, at pregnancy exam, and also throughout at the beginning of the next breeding season. They were the same age at puberty, but pregnancy rates for heifers from supplemented dams were increased, and more of them calved during the first 21 days, which is a kind of a similar response to what we saw in the last study. In the table over here on the right, you see results from the study by Martin and others provide similar results to those reported by Funston. So those studies kind of agree with each other. However, the study we have by Shoup and others showed that there was no difference in heifer progeny performance from cows that were provided with no supplement, a low level of supplement, or a high level of supplement. So some of the potential differences for these results might be explained by differences in calving season. Obviously, forage type and quality. Does appear that there's some potential for protein supplementation to impact female offspring reproductive performance, but these results are, again, pretty inconsistent. So Dr. Blair mentioned several of these variables earlier that kind of impact some of the results, but I think as you're looking at the results of any type of study, it's important to kind of evaluate what kind of cattle they were using, what were their age and condition, health status also enters in there. I think we've proven throughout the evening that stage of gestation definitely impacts the types of tissues and organs that might be affected. Also need to consider the type of stressor or nutrient imbalance that the cows are dealing with, how long that's being implemented and how severe it is. Some of these treatments can get pretty severe and might be out of the realm of what the cows might encounter in a typical production situation. And we've talked repeatedly about forage quality and environment throughout the night. And so this is one of our main challenges when we're conducting research, particularly in a production environment, to try to account for those differences and knowing that we can't always control for all those inherent differences that are going to potentially impact responses. Another factor that will play a role, obviously, is genetic background, genetic potential, and then you also have to think through potentially some of those epigenetic or heritable changes that are passed down through multiple generations. And so some of those offspring might be carrying genes that were several generations back that have just been turned on due to nutritional treatment from a great-granddam, for example. And then, of course, it's not always possible when you think about it to try to separate postnatal factors that the calf might experience from those factors that it experienced during gestation, such as maternal nutrition. And so there's definitely the potential for those postnatal factors, such as environment, milk production, to kind of interact and either maybe soften or even exaggerate the response of offspring due to fetal programming. Okay, we're just about wrapping up here. Probably some of you have seen some of these articles, maybe in your favorite ag publication or online. Despite some of our limitations, this is definitely a hot topic in the livestock industry. And we're definitely seeing more of the research results kind of being translated into our industry publications. So you're likely going to see more of these as time goes on. So where do we go from here? Well, I guess Dr. Blair and my main goals were just to basically talk through the developmental processes happening during specific times of gestation, talk about how changes in maternal nutrition can possibly influence the offspring, but also show you that we have a lot of inconsistencies in our results. We don't necessarily fully understand all the mechanisms. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a limited availability of data that really follows an animal throughout its productive life in terms of stayability in the cow herd, for example. So there's a lot of things we don't understand and a lot of things we don't know. I think awareness of this topic is really important, but so is the ability to really critically evaluate the data. So it's not going to really be prudent for us to try to make specific recommendations or try to analyze how to use this concept as a tool for your management system. So what we can do is use this knowledge about fetal development and nutrition to try to promote positive changes that can possibly impact animal performance in your herd. So a couple examples here, maybe using supplementation to help increase animal performance during those key periods of development in the fetus, which is nearly every period, but using different supplementation strategies and adapting those as we go. Maybe taking a really close look at our grazing systems and management, making some potential changes to optimize performance if needed. Third bullet here, managing based on conditions and not the calendar. And I think this is a really important one. Maybe instead of having a set weaning date every year, we're kind of evaluating body condition, thinking about maybe some early weaning or other strategies that's going to be positive for both the cow and her developing calf. And then finally, don't forget about important and really simple tools like body condition scoring and lab analysis of feeds that I mentioned earlier to be able to evaluate the success of your nutritional programs. And with that, we'll wrap it up. I'd like to just thank you for your time and attention and be happy to entertain any questions.
Well, thank you so much to both of our great speakers for tonight's presentations. This partnership between NCGA and NCBA is, oh, sorry, my screen's moving around here. This partnership's all about bringing the latest relevant information to producers across the industry, and each of our presenters tonight have certainly helped us achieve that goal. As we move into our question and answer session for tonight, please remember to type your questions into the question chat box. And let's get to your questions. Thank you again for participating in the webinar tonight, and I'll now hand it over to Jesse Fulton, Director of Producer Education with NCBA, to moderate tonight's question and answer.
Thanks, Michael. I greatly appreciate it. And I greatly appreciate Amanda and Jana joining us tonight for the presentation. So, Jana, I'll start off with a question for you. And I know as you went through, you covered a lot of different research that had very different amounts of restriction. But have we really narrowed down on where the limit is defined? I think the highest I saw was maybe 80% restricted, or they were providing 80%, only restricting by 20%. But do we know where that line is drawn and when we're really starting to affect the calf? So if we were to do 90%, would that really have an effect on the calf?
That's a very good question. So, I mean, since we are talking about research here, like I said before, some of these treatments aren't necessarily relevant to, what a cow might actually experience, in a ranch environment. We are kind of trying to push the envelope in some situations just to figure out where that line is. And I would say we're not maybe entirely sure of where it is. I think we obviously don't want to compromise animal performance to the point of losing the animal on the research trial. And this does happen in some situations, but we try to avoid those really, huge extremes in terms of restriction, just to make sure that we're not going to compromise, animal health and things like that. I would definitely say, as I mentioned at one point, when I talked about a change in birth weight, that's pretty rare that you would actually see, a change in birth weight in beef cattle. Again, it's amazing what that dam can go through and how she can buffer the effects of that restriction on her fetus. And somehow those calves seem like they develop to a normal birth weight. But I think, looking at that 75% restriction in energy requirements, that's definitely a point where those cows, I think, I'd have to go back and look at the study, but they were losing around 2 pounds a day. So that would definitely be a bad situation to be encountering in late gestation. So yeah, not always applicable to what your cows might experience. It's just kind of giving you some things to think about in terms of, what might be affected and what responses you might see.
All right, thank you. Amanda, in your SDSU study that you first talked about, the calves that came in weighing 9 pounds lighter, were they receiving any type of creep feed when they were out in the field or not?
No, that was they were out with those cows at side and at the SDSU experiment station in western South Dakota, where that was conducted. There was no creep feed provided to those calves prior to weaning. So yeah, that wouldn't have that wouldn't have influenced the outcomes of that study.
All right. And I'll let you both take a jab at this one, because I know it's something that a lot of producers are kind of told to try to achieve when they're breeding their heifers. Does it ever make sense to try to get our heifers above a body condition score of 6, when for their first gestation? And Jan, I'll let you go take a jab at that first.
Okay. So getting above a body condition score of 6 before calving?
Or even before breeding. That way
breeding, okay.
Throughout gestation.
Okay. I've never really seen a lot of data that indicates that would be necessary. The data that we have that has established that relationship between body condition at calving and breeding with reproductive performance really indicates that if we've got the mature cows at a 5 and the heifers at a 6, they're going to be able to, meet all their requirements and the requirements of that calf. That's giving heifers a little bit of extra energy reserves to support her own growth. And obviously you can do other things too, like, breeding the heifers earlier, which gives them more time to recover before they're joining the mature cows. Some people will also manage even second calf heifers separately into a group of, put them with the first calf heifers and kind of manage those separately. But again, I haven't really seen a lot of data saying you need to get them more fat than that. And I do know once we get past that body condition score of about a 7, you're really going to get into a point where you could actually damage reproductive performance because the heifers just get too fat. So there's impacts on their mammary gland development. And then they also can have potentially more calving difficulty just again because they are so fat.
Amanda, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Jana covered it pretty well, and that's probably a good question for the nutritionist to cover.
Well, I guess this can go either to Jana or Amanda, but I know there was some research coming out of Nebraska where they were breeding heifers at a body condition score, or maybe it was even cows at a body condition score of 4. So if we were to get those animals to stick at a body condition score, but continue to improve their body condition throughout gestation, what type of differences would we might see in the calf?
Jana, you want to try that one, or you want me to?
Go ahead.
Well, you can probably follow up on this. I guess more, maybe not necessarily an answer to that, but just a thought that I've had. And again, there's not really been a lot of time to conduct all this research yet, but I've often wondered. We've conducted studies where they've, and we've seen others across the country conduct studies where we've lost a body condition score. I've often wondered if, like you said, breeding at a 4, breeding them at a body condition 4 and then gaining some condition. So putting them into a positive energy status versus a negative energy status kind of goes along with that study that we conducted at STSU. But I often wondered if, there's cows out there that potentially could go from a 6 to a 5, and some that could go the other way. So is it really the composition of that dam and her tissues and what she has available, or is it the fact that she's gaining or losing that's affecting that transfer of nutrients to the fetus? So again, maybe not a direct answer to your question of what would happen, but I think there's certainly research, and Jana alluded to this, is when you overfeed cattle, that can also cause some developmental programming, having excess nutrients, but we don't have a great handle on what gets to the fetus and what might be transferred. And again, that's going to vary hugely. Some cows, we've seen this before, that they'll give up all their body reserves to that calf and for lactation. And there's some cows that are very good at kind of keeping their own condition. And that those cows might work well in different environments.
Great, Dr. Blair, thank you. So I guess I haven't really seen a lot of data where we might be breeding at a body condition score of 4. I guess the data I'm thinking of, and again, a lot of this is out of Nebraska, is where, and this could possibly relate back to body condition, but where they've developed heifers to a lighter weight at breeding. And so, for many, many years, our industry recommendation was 65% of mature weight at breeding. And several of the researchers in Nebraska have kind of indicated that producers might be able to get by with producing heifers at around 55 to 60% of that mature weight at breeding, still making sure that they note that it's still really important for those animals to reach 85% of mature weight at calving. So they're going to have a lot further to go between breeding and calving in order to kind of play catch up. And so you kind of have to balance, the trade-offs there. I'm not super comfortable, I guess, for myself with that 55%. I've looked at quite a few studies, and I think that I feel a little bit better when I'm in that 58 to 60% of mature weight at breeding. And some of their data does really indicate that this can make us a more efficient cow, that we maybe overfeed some of the heifers during development by developing them in a lot. And maybe we can use kind of more of a range type of development system and maybe make ourselves some cows that are more efficient at utilizing the nutrients that they have. I think that the genetic potential of the animals that we're thinking about is going to be really important in terms of their ability to kind of adapt to that maybe decreased level of nutrition and still perform at the level that you want to see.
All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies. Looks like we're out of time for tonight. I know there's a couple more questions on here. I will send those to our presenters, and they will be able to answer those and return an email to you. For those of you who are still on, I want to invite you to join us online virtually. Our stockmanship and stewardship event is going virtual. So November the 11th through the 12th, we're going to have multiple cattle handling demonstrations that are recorded for you to view with Kurt Pate and Ron Gill and Dean Fish. There's also some exciting sessions on a wide variety of topics from not only our beef quality assurance program, but business and risk management, cattle health and welfare, and some of our policy issues and a reaction on the election. So this event is taking place just 1 week after the election. So we're going to hear from our DC team on what they forecast in the future based on who is elected into office. So go ahead and get registered today. It is for free, and the first 200 registrants will receive a complimentary welcome packet and gift courtesy of Merck Animal Health. So Dr. Blair, Dr. Block, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.